Tonight is not about fixing your life. It is not about becoming better, wiser, calmer, or more spiritual. All of that effort is exactly what keeps the mind awake. Tonight is about letting the effort collapse. The Buddha never taught peace as something to be achieved. He taught it as something that appears when grasping ends. Right now, your mind is still holding thoughts, holding identity, holding memory, holding tomorrow. Even the wish to sleep is another form of holding. So for a moment, stop trying to arrive anywhere. You do not need to concentrate. You do not need to understand. You do not need to improve yourself through this. Let the words wash over you without response. Let them pass without agreement or resistance. This is not a lesson to remember. It is a permission to forget. Let the mind fade. Letting go is not an action. Most people believe letting go is something you do because the mind only understands action. From childhood, you are trained to solve problems by effort. If something feels wrong, you try harder. If something hurts, you fix it. If something is uncomfortable, you change it. This conditioning runs so deep that even when people hear the words "let go," they immediately search for a method, a step, or a technique. But this is where the misunderstanding begins. Letting go is not a movement towards something better. It is not a shift you initiate. It is not a mental decision that suddenly releases tension. Any attempt to do letting go quietly reinforces the belief that you are in control of the mind, and that belief is exactly what sustains attachment. In Buddhist teaching, attachment does not survive because you are weak or undisciplined. It survives because the mind is convinced it must manage experience in order to be safe. This is subtle but critical. The mind clings not out of desire alone, but out of fear. Fear that without control, things will fall apart. Fear that without effort, something important will be lost. Fear that without constant monitoring, the self will dissolve. And in a way, that fear is accurate. The self does dissolve when effort stops. That is precisely why the mind resists letting go. Clinging is not sustained by force. You are not gripping thoughts the way a hand grips an object. You are gripping them through identification. You believe they belong to you. You believe they define you. You believe they protect you. As long as that belief is operating, effort will continue automatically, even if you consciously want peace. This is why trying to relax never works. The command "relax" is itself an effort. It implies that tension is a problem that must be removed. But the moment you treat tension as a problem, the mind becomes active again. It starts managing, correcting, adjusting, and now you are back in the same loop that caused restlessness in the first place. Letting go begins not when tension disappears, but when the demand for tension to disappear ends. This is a difficult idea for the modern mind because it contradicts everything it has been taught. We are taught that improvement comes from intervention. Buddhism points in the opposite direction. It says that suffering continues because of unnecessary intervention. The mind interferes with processes that are already self-correcting. Thoughts rise on their own. They do not ask permission. They do not require instruction. They appear the same way sounds appear or sensations appear. And yet, the mind claims ownership over them. It says, "This is my thought. This thought matters. This thought requires a response." That claim is where attachment begins. Notice something carefully, without trying to change it. Thoughts do not stay because you think them well. They stay because you engage with them. The moment you stop engaging, they weaken. Not immediately, and not dramatically, but inevitably, like a fire that fades when fuel is no longer added. The mistake most people make is trying to remove thoughts. They push them away. They replace them with affirmations. They redirect attention aggressively. All of this is cooperation with the same belief that thoughts must be controlled. Buddhist practice does not teach control. It teaches non-cooperation. Non-cooperation means you do not fight the mind, but you also do not assist it. You let thoughts rise without feeding them with commentary. You let them fall without chasing closure. You stop acting as if every mental event requires management. This is where letting go actually happens. When you stop cooperating with the impulse to manage experience, something strange occurs. The mind begins to unwind on its own, not because you commanded it to, but because the tension sustaining it is gone. You were never holding thoughts up with strength. You were holding them up with attention and belief. Think of it like this. If you clench your fist all day, your hand becomes tired. But if you believe that something precious is inside your fist, you will keep clenching no matter how painful it becomes. The moment you realize there is nothing there, the hand relaxes naturally. You do not force it to open. You simply stop believing it must stay closed. That is letting go. Notice how thoughts rise on their own. You did not schedule them. You did not approve them. They simply appeared. If they can arise without your effort, they can also dissolve without your effort. Your only role in their persistence is participation. Notice how thoughts fall on their own when attention shifts. Not because you pushed them away, but because nothing held them in place. This is why Buddhist meditation does not aim at creating silence. Silence is a byproduct. The aim is insight into how suffering is manufactured, and suffering is manufactured through unnecessary involvement. You are not responsible for the movement of thoughts. That idea alone dismantles a lifetime of conditioning. Responsibility implies control. Control implies effort. Effort implies self. And self is the center of tension. When responsibility drops, effort drops with it. This does not mean thoughts stop immediately. It means your relationship to them changes. They become less convincing, less urgent, less personal. They lose the power to keep the body alert and the nervous system activated. The moment you stop interfering, release begins naturally. Not as a dramatic event, but as a quiet shift. Muscles soften without instruction, breathing deepens without guidance. Attention narrows without force. This is why sleep comes more easily when you stop trying to sleep. Sleep, like letting go, is not an action. It is something that happens when action ends. People who struggle with rest often believe they must reach a certain mental state before they are allowed to relax. Buddhism dismantles that belief completely. It says, rest is the default when clinging is absent. You do not earn rest by thinking correctly. You return to it by stopping interference. The hand does not relax because you tell it to. It relaxes because it realizes there is nothing to grip. The mind does not quiet because you command it to. It quiets because it realizes there is nothing it needs to control. This realization cannot be forced, it cannot be rushed, and it cannot be performed. It emerges when you stop trying to manage experience and allow it to unfold without ownership. That is why letting go is not an action. It is the absence of a mistaken one. And the moment that absence appears, even briefly, the mind remembers something it never truly forgot. How to be still without trying. 2. The mind does not need to be silenced. One of the most persistent misunderstandings in spiritual practice is the belief that peace arrives when the mind becomes quiet. People imagine silence as an empty mental space, free from thought, free from movement, free from disturbance. And because they believe this is the goal, they spend years trying to silence themselves. That attempt is the problem. The mind does not become peaceful through suppression. It becomes restless. Every effort to silence thought turns thought into an enemy, and the moment you create an enemy, vigilance appears. Vigilance requires energy. Energy keeps the nervous system alert, and an alert nervous system cannot rest. The Buddha never taught silence as something to be manufactured. He observed silence as something that appears when interference ends. This distinction matters more than it seems. Manufactured silence is fragile. It requires constant maintenance. Natural silence sustains itself because nothing is fighting against it. When you try to quiet the mind, you are still assuming that thought is a problem. That assumption alone creates tension. The mind begins monitoring itself, watching for noise, correcting deviation, measuring progress. Even if the mind becomes temporarily calm, the calm is unstable because it depends on effort. This is why forced calm never lasts. Thoughts arise for many reasons. Some are habits, some are emotional residue, some are the nervous system discharging energy. None of these processes are wrong. They are natural responses to being alive. Treating them as intrusions only strengthens them. In Buddhist teaching, suffering does not arise from thought itself. It arises from resistance to thought. The moment you push against mental activity, you create a second layer of activity. Now there is the thought, and the reaction to the thought. That reaction is what creates exhaustion. The mind does not need to be silenced because it is not the source of disturbance. The struggle with the mind is. Notice how silence naturally appears in ordinary moments. When you are absorbed in something simple, when you are walking without thinking about walking, when you are about to fall asleep. You are not creating silence in these moments. You are simply not interfering. Silence arrives when the demand for silence disappears. This is difficult for the modern mind because it equates peace with control. If the mind is not being managed, it feels unsafe. But Buddhism points to a deeper safety that exists beneath control, a safety that does not depend on monitoring every mental movement. When you stop trying to quiet the mind, something counterintuitive happens. The intensity of thought decreases, not because thoughts are suppressed, but because they are no longer being energized by resistance. They come and go without echo. Think of sound in an empty room. A noise occurs. It does not fight the silence. It dissolves into it. The silence was never destroyed by the sound. It simply allowed the sound to pass. The mind is the same. Silence is not fragile. It is vast. Thoughts are small by comparison. They only feel overwhelming when you believe you must respond to them. Allow the mind to speak without responding. This does not mean indulging it. It means letting it express itself without interference. You are neither agreeing with thoughts nor rejecting them. You are simply not adding yourself to them. This non-response is not indifference. It is understanding. You understand that thoughts are events, not instructions. When you stop responding, the mind begins to unwind, not immediately, not predictably, but steadily. The nervous system shifts from vigilance to rest. Breathing slows without direction. Muscles soften without command. This is not something you do. It is something that happens when doing stops. Many people fear that if they do not silence the mind, it will run endlessly. This fear is based on experience, but the experience is incomplete. The mind runs endlessly only when it is being fed. Each reaction is food. Each judgment is fuel. Each attempt to control is engagement. When engagement ends, momentum fades. Silence, in Buddhist understanding, is not the absence of sound or thought. It is the absence of struggle with sound or thought. You can be silent even while the mind is active, because silence is not a condition of content. It is a condition of relationship. The moment the relationship shifts from control to allowance, The mind loses its urgency. Thoughts no longer need to compete for attention. They no longer need to escalate. This is why deep rest does not come from discipline. It comes from permission. Permission for the mind to be as it is without supervision. When supervision ends, the system relaxes. Silence is not something you enter, it is something you stop leaving. And when the mind realizes it no longer needs to shout to be heard, it naturally becomes quiet. Not because you forced it to, but because nothing is fighting it anymore. 3. You are not the thinker. Almost everyone assumes they are the thinker of their thoughts. This assumption is so deeply embedded that it is rarely questioned. From the moment a thought appears, it is claimed automatically. My thought, my worry, my memory, my problem. The claim happens so fast that it feels inseparable from the thought itself. But this assumption is never examined. The Buddha did not begin by asking people to stop thinking. He asked them to look closely, to observe carefully what is actually happening. When observation deepens, a strange realization begins to surface. Thoughts appear, but there is no clear evidence of a thinker producing them. This is not a poetic idea, it is an experiential one. If you slow down enough, you can notice that thoughts arrive unannounced. You do not decide which thought comes next. You do not schedule them. You do not authorize them. A memory appears. A sentence forms. An image flashes. And only after it has already appeared does the mind claim ownership. The claim comes second. This matters more than most people realize, because ownership creates responsibility. Responsibility creates effort. Effort creates tension, and tension keeps the system awake. The belief, I am the thinker, is not neutral. It forces you into a role you cannot successfully perform. If you believe you are responsible for your thoughts, then every unwanted thought feels like a failure. Every intrusive image feels like a threat. Every restless moment feels like something you must correct. But what if that role was never yours? The Buddha described the self not as an entity, but as a process, a collection of habits, reactions, perceptions, and beliefs moving together. Thought is part of that process, but it is not controlled by a central authority. There is no command center issuing thoughts into existence. This is why attempts to control the mind fail. You are trying to control something that was never under direct control in the first place. Look closely at how thinking actually works. A thought appears. It may be triggered by sensation, memory, or nothing obvious at all. It stays for a moment. Then it changes or disappears. Another replaces it. This continues whether you approve or not. If you were the thinker, you would be able to stop thoughts at will. You would be able to choose only pleasant ones. You would never be surprised by what appears in your own mind. But you are surprised constantly. That surprise is evidence. The Buddha's insight was not that thoughts are bad or dangerous. It was that identification with thought is unnecessary and exhausting. When you stop identifying, thoughts lose their authority. They become events, not commands, movements, not messages. This does not require believing a new idea. It requires seeing what is already happening. Notice this carefully. When a thought appears, where does it come from? Not conceptually, directly. Can you locate its origin? Can you see it forming before it appears? Or does it simply arise fully formed? And when it disappears, where does it go? Does it leave a trace? Does it announce its departure? Or does it simply vanish when attention moves elsewhere? If you cannot find the source or destination of a thought, how can you be its owner? Ownership implies possession. Possession implies control. Control implies effort. But thought does not obey effort. It obeys conditions. This realization alone can radically change your relationship with the mind. You are not the thinker. You are the space in which thinking happens. That statement is often misunderstood. People turn it into another identity. I am awareness. I am consciousness. That is just another costume for the same habit. Buddhism does not replace one identity with a better one. It loosens identification altogether. You are not required to adopt a new label. You are only asked to stop clinging to the old one. When identification loosens, something subtle but powerful occurs. Thoughts still arise, but they no longer carry urgency. They do not feel like instructions that must be followed. They feel more like weather passing through an open landscape. A cloud appears. It does not demand engagement. It does not require interpretation. It simply moves. This is why the Buddha emphasized observation without interference. Not because observation creates distance, but because it reveals truth. When you observe thoughts without claiming them, you see their impermanence directly. And impermanence weakens attachment naturally. The mind stays restless, not because thoughts exist, but because they are taken personally. Each thought is treated as evidence about who you are, what you must do, or what is wrong. This constant personalization keeps the nervous system activated. When personalization drops, rest becomes possible. This does not mean thoughts stop. It means they stop mattering in the same way. Imagine hearing a conversation in another room. You can hear voices, but you are not involved. You do not react emotionally. You do not plan responses. You do not feel threatened. The sounds are present, but they do not disturb you. This is how thoughts begin to feel when identification loosens. They may still be loud at first. Habits take time to unwind, but without ownership, they lose their grip. They no longer hook attention with the same force. The Buddha described this as freedom, not from thought, but from bondage to thought. The bondage comes from believing thoughts define reality. Once that belief weakens, the mind becomes lighter. This is especially important for rest and sleep. Sleep does not require a silent mind. It requires a non-identified mind. Children fall asleep easily, not because they have fewer thoughts, but because they do not take their thoughts seriously. They do not build identity around them. Adults struggle because every thought feels consequential. Every mental movement is treated as important. This constant importance keeps the system awake. When you see that you are not the thinker, importance drains away. Thoughts still come, but they come without obligation. You do not need to finish them. You do not need to resolve them. You do not need to answer them. They complete themselves when attention no longer feeds them. This is why trying to stop thinking never works. It keeps attention glued to thought. But seeing that thoughts are not yours loosens attention effortlessly. There is nothing mystical about this. It is practical. When you stop identifying with thought, the body responds immediately. Muscles soften. Breathing deepens. The vigilance that kept you alert begins to fade. Not because you commanded it to, but because the system no longer feels responsible for maintaining control. The belief, I am the thinker, is heavy. It places the burden of mental activity on something that cannot carry it. Letting go of that belief is not loss, it is relief. You do not disappear when identification fades. What disappears is the strain of pretending to be in charge. And in that relief, the mind begins to rest on its own. Not because it was silenced, but because no one is trying to manage it anymore. 4. Rest comes from non-ownership. Most people believe they are tired because they do too much. They assume exhaustion is caused by activity, responsibility, or lack of sleep. Sometimes that is true. But very often, The deepest fatigue has nothing to do with what you are doing. It comes from what you believe you are carrying. You can be lying in bed, doing nothing, and still feel exhausted. The body is still, but the weight remains. That weight is not physical. It is psychological ownership. Ownership is subtle. It does not feel like effort. It feels like obligation. The sense that something is yours to hold, yours to manage, yours to protect. Thoughts feel owned. Emotions feel owned. Problems feel owned. Even identities feel owned. This sense of ownership creates a constant background tension. The mind stays alert because it believes something important depends on it. The nervous system remains activated because it assumes responsibility cannot be dropped. Buddhist teaching cuts directly through this assumption. The Buddha did not describe suffering as the presence of pain. He described it as clinging. And clinging is nothing more than ownership applied to experience. The moment you say, "This is mine," tension begins. Because what is owned can be lost, damaged, judged, or threatened. Ownership demands vigilance. Think about how the body feels when you are responsible for something fragile. There is a subtle tightening, a readiness to react, a refusal to fully relax. That is the same posture the mind takes when it believes experience belongs to it. You are not just carrying tasks, you are carrying narratives, stories about who you are supposed to be, expectations about how things should unfold, interpretations of past events, predictions about the future, emotional residue from conversations that ended long ago. None of this weighs anything physically, yet it drains enormous energy. Rest does not come from removing these things one by one. That would be another project, another effort, another form of ownership. Rest comes from seeing that none of this was ever yours to carry in the first place. This is what non-ownership actually means. It does not mean indifference. It does not mean avoidance. It means recognizing that experience happens, but it does not belong to a central self. Thoughts arise. They do not need an owner. Emotions move. They do not require possession. Sensations appear. They do not belong to anyone. Ownership is added afterward. The mind learns ownership early. A child is taught to say, "My name, my feelings, my mistakes, my future." This training creates a functional identity, but it also creates unnecessary burden. The identity becomes something that must be maintained, defended, improved, and protected. Over time, this maintenance becomes exhausting. Notice how much energy goes into preserving a sense of self, monitoring how you are perceived, replaying conversations, anticipating outcomes, correcting internal narratives. This effort is so constant that it becomes invisible. You only notice it when it stops. Non-ownership allows it to stop. When ownership drops, something profound happens. The system realizes it no longer needs to be on guard. There is no fragile self at the center that must be defended. Experience can move freely without being managed. This does not require rejecting the world. It requires loosening the belief that you are the one holding it together. For this moment, nothing needs to be carried. No identity needs reinforcement. No emotion needs justification. No thought needs completion. The body understands this immediately. Shoulders drop, jaw softens, breathing changes without instruction. These are not techniques. They are responses to relief. The relief of not owning. Many people resist this idea because they confuse ownership with responsibility. They believe that without ownership, life will fall apart. But look closely. Life functioned before you learned to own it. Breathing happens without ownership. Digestion happens without ownership. Healing happens without ownership. Ownership does not create order. It creates strain. The Buddha did not tell people to abandon their lives. He pointed out that suffering arises when we mistake participation for possession. You can participate in experience without owning it. You can feel without clinging. You can think without identifying. This distinction is subtle but transformative. When you stop owning experience, rest becomes possible even in the presence of activity. You no longer need perfect conditions to relax. Silence is no longer required. Control is no longer necessary. This is why some people can rest in chaos, while others cannot rest in silence. The difference is not circumstance, it is ownership. When ownership drops, even briefly, the mind experiences something unfamiliar: effortlessness. Not the effortlessness of pleasure, but the effortlessness of absence. The absence of burden. The absence of maintenance. This is what deep rest actually is. Not sleep. Not calm. Not bliss. Relief from carrying. You may notice resistance as you hear this. The mind may ask, if I don't own my thoughts, who does? That question itself reveals the habit. It assumes ownership must exist somewhere. Buddhism does not relocate ownership. It dissolves the assumption entirely. Experience does not require an owner to occur. Rain does not need a manager. Wind does not need a controller. Thought does not need a thinker. Ownership is a concept layered on top of natural processes. When that layer softens, the nervous system exits survival mode. It no longer feels responsible for maintaining a self-image or controlling outcomes. Energy that was locked into vigilance becomes available for rest. This is why rest cannot be forced. Force is ownership in action. Rest appears when ownership loosens. For this moment, you do not need to hold anything together. You do not need to make sense of your life. You do not need to resolve your identity. You are allowed to exist without managing existence. This permission is rarely given in daily life, but it is always available internally. The Buddha did not invent it. He noticed it, and once noticed, it cannot be unseen. When ownership dissolves, even briefly, rest is no longer something you chase, it is what remains. Not because you earned it, but because you finally put down what you were never meant to carry. 5. Sleep is a form of trust. Most people believe sleep is something they should be able to control. They talk about trying to sleep, making themselves sleep, or fixing their sleep. This language reveals the real issue. Sleep has been turned into a task, and tasks require effort. Effort keeps the nervous system alert. An alert system cannot surrender. Sleep has never been an achievement. It has always been an act of trust. From a Buddhist perspective, the mind does not resist sleep because it dislikes rest. It resists sleep because sleep requires letting go of control. When consciousness fades, the identity loosens. The sense of "I am managing this moment" disappears. For a mind that has learned to survive through control, this feels threatening. So, it stays awake. Not because it wants to think, but because it does not trust what happens when thinking stops. This is why insomnia often worsens when life feels uncertain, when identity feels fragile, when the future feels unresolved. The mind becomes a guard. It stays awake to protect a version of you it believes must be maintained. The Buddha taught that suffering arises from craving and aversion. Sleep difficulty is often both at once: craving for rest, aversion to surrender. Wanting sleep desperately while fearing the loss of control sleep requires. This inner conflict keeps the system tense. Sleep is not a state you enter, it is a state that takes you. Every night, consciousness fades without consulting your plans. You do not supervise the moment you fall asleep. You do not witness the exact second awareness dissolves. It happens beyond your authority. This has always been true. Yet the mind resists accepting it. Trust, in Buddhist understanding, is not belief in a positive outcome. It is willingness to release control without guarantees. Sleep demands exactly that. You must allow awareness to dim without checking whether it is safe, without confirming that everything is resolved, without making sure tomorrow is handled. This is why sleep feels impossible when the mind insists on resolution. The Buddha never promised resolution before rest. He observed that life remains unresolved by nature, impermanent, incomplete, always in motion. Waiting for closure before surrender is a condition that will never be met. So the mind stays awake, waiting for something that cannot arrive. Trust means resting without resolution. This is difficult because modern life trains the mind to equate safety with preparedness. If you are prepared, you are safe. If you are alert, you are protected. Sleep contradicts this logic completely. It asks you to become unavailable, unresponsive, vulnerable. And yet, you have slept thousands of times before. Each time, control was released. Each time, the body continued breathing, the heart continued beating, life continued without supervision. The evidence is overwhelming, but the habit of mistrust remains. The Buddha described impermanence not as a philosophical concept, but as a lived reality. Everything fades, everything changes. Sleep is a nightly rehearsal of this truth. Consciousness dissolves temporarily. Identity softens. The story pauses. For the mind that clings to identity, this feels like loss. For the mind that understands impermanence, it feels like relief. Sleep is not a collapse. It is a return. When you stop trying to sleep, you remove the pressure that keeps the system awake. Trying implies effort. Effort implies control. Control implies vigilance. Vigilance keeps the mind active. Allowing sleep implies trust. Trust does not mean forcing surrender. It means removing resistance to surrender. You do not push yourself into sleep. You stop preventing it. Notice how often the mind checks itself. Am I sleepy yet? Is this working? Why am I still awake? Each check is a small act of control. Each one brings the mind back into activity. The Buddha would call this grasping. Grasping at outcome. Grasping at timing. Grasping at certainty. Sleep does not respond to grasping. The moment you stop monitoring the process begins. This is why people often fall asleep accidentally. While watching something dull, while listening without focus, while no longer trying. Sleep arrives when attention loosens its grip. Trust feels passive to a mind addicted to effort. It feels irresponsible. But it is not negligence. It is wisdom. Wisdom recognizes when intervention is unnecessary. The body knows how to sleep. It has always known. Long before you learned how to think, it slept. Long before you learned to worry, it rested. That knowledge has not been lost. It has only been overridden by control. Trust allows that knowledge to surface again. The Buddha taught that non-doing is not laziness. It is alignment with reality. Reality does not need to be managed at every moment. Much of life unfolds on its own when interference stops. Sleep is one of those processes. Letting yourself be taken by sleep is an act of humility. It acknowledges that you are not in charge of everything, that life continues without your supervision, that you are allowed to disappear for a while. This disappearance is not dangerous. It is nourishing. Many people fear sleep because they unconsciously equate awareness with existence. If awareness fades, something feels threatened. But Buddhism gently corrects this misunderstanding. Existence does not depend on constant awareness. Life continues in deep sleep. The self relaxes. Suffering pauses. You do not disappear. You are relieved. Trust does not mean convincing yourself everything is fine. It means allowing things to be unfinished, allowing questions to remain unanswered, allowing tomorrow to exist without rehearsal. For this night, nothing needs to be solved. Nothing needs to be secured. Nothing needs to be watched. You are allowed to rest without permission. When trust replaces control, the nervous system receives a clear signal. There is no emergency. There is no threat requiring vigilance. The body shifts from defense to restoration. This shift cannot be forced. It happens when the demand for certainty ends. The Buddha did not teach people how to sleep better. He taught them how to stop clinging. Better sleep follows naturally when clinging loosens. Sleep is not the reward for doing the day correctly. It is the natural state of a system that no longer feels responsible for maintaining everything. You do not fall asleep by effort. You are taken by it when effort releases. Trust does not announce itself. It does not feel dramatic. It feels like giving up the last argument with the moment. And when that argument ends, sleep no longer needs to be chased. It arrives quietly, not because you earned it, but because you finally stopped standing in its way. 6. Nothing needs to be resolved. The mind believes rest comes after resolution, after clarity, after understanding, after closure. It carries the assumption that something unfinished is dangerous, and that sleep should only arrive once everything is settled. This belief keeps the mind awake more effectively than fear. Look closely at how restlessness actually works. You are not awake because there is a problem. You are awake because the mind insists the problem must be solved now. It keeps reviewing, replaying, organizing, and planning, not because resolution is possible, but because resolution feels necessary for safety. Buddhist teaching cuts directly through this assumption. Life does not resolve itself before continuing. It unfolds incomplete, imperfect, and uncertain. Waiting for resolution before allowing rest is a condition that reality never satisfies. The mind waits for a moment that does not exist, and in that waiting, it exhausts itself. This is why the mind often becomes most active at night. During the day, distraction hides the habit. At night, when stimulation fades, unresolved material surfaces. The mind interprets this surfacing as a signal that something must be fixed. But surfacing does not mean urgency. The Buddha observed that suffering comes not from uncertainty, but from resistance to uncertainty. The mind does not suffer because things are unresolved. It suffers because it demands resolution before allowing peace. This demand is learned. It is not natural. As children, rest came easily, not because life was simpler, but because we did not require understanding in order to relax. We did not need explanations for why things happened. We did not demand closure from the day before allowing sleep. That demand was learned later, along with identity and responsibility. The belief, "I must understand before I can rest," sounds reasonable, but it is false. Understanding does not bring rest, it postpones it. Think about how many things in your life remain unresolved. Relationships that ended without explanation, decisions that never felt fully right, questions that have no clear answer. And yet, life continued. You continued. Resolution did not arrive, but survival did. The mind ignores this evidence. It insists that this time is different, that this thought is important, that this concern must be addressed now. This insistence is not intelligence, it is habit. Buddhism does not promise answers to every question. It promises freedom from the need for answers. That freedom is what allows rest. Nothing needs to be resolved because resolution is not what creates safety. The body does not require answers to relax. It requires the absence of threat. And unresolved questions are not threats. The belief that they are is the real danger. Notice how the mind behaves when it believes something is unresolved. It tightens, it speeds up, it narrows attention, it enters problem-solving mode. This mode is useful during the day. It is destructive at night. Sleep requires openness, not precision. It requires surrender, not clarity. The Buddha taught that clinging takes many forms. One of the most subtle is clinging to understanding, the belief that if you can just see clearly enough, everything will be okay. This belief sounds noble, but it quietly sustains restlessness. Understanding is endless. There is always more context, more nuance, more possibility. If you wait for understanding to be complete, you will never rest. This does not mean understanding is bad. It means it is not a prerequisite for peace. Unanswered questions do not need to be answered tonight. Unfinished conversations do not need to be replayed. Uncertain futures do not need rehearsal. The mind treats unresolved material like open loops that must be closed. But many loops in life never close. They fade instead. They lose relevance. They dissolve with time, not resolution. Sleep allows this fading to happen. When you insist on resolving everything, you interrupt the natural process by which things lose their grip. Some things only loosen when attention stops circling them. Sleep is one of the ways attention releases. This is why the Buddha emphasized letting things be, not because things are perfect, but because interference often creates more suffering than it removes. Resolution is often just control wearing a calmer face. The mind says, if I can just figure this out, I can relax. But what it really means is, I don't trust myself to rest while things are unfinished. This is not wisdom, it is mistrust. Trust does not mean believing everything will turn out well. It means allowing yourself to rest even when you do not know how things will turn out. This is especially important at night. Night is not for solving life. It is for releasing life. Problems that feel urgent at night often shrink by morning, not because they were solved, but because rest restored perspective. The Buddha understood this deeply. He did not encourage people to carry their burdens endlessly. He showed them how to put them down, even temporarily. For this moment, nothing requires your attention. Nothing needs to be completed. Nothing needs to make sense. You are allowed to rest with uncertainty present. The mind will resist this at first. It will offer reasons. But this matters. But this is important. But I can't forget this. These are not facts. They are habits of attachment. You do not need to argue with them. Arguing is engagement. You only need to stop obeying them. Let unresolved things remain unresolved. They have been unresolved before. They will be unresolved again. And life will continue regardless. Rest does not come from tying up every loose end. It comes from releasing the belief that loose ends are dangerous. When that belief softens, the nervous system relaxes, breathing deepens, mental urgency fades, not because problems disappeared, but because the demand to solve them right now has ended. The Buddha did not teach people to escape life. He taught them to stop carrying it constantly. You can put life down for a few hours. Nothing will break. Nothing will be lost. Nothing needs to be resolved for you to rest. And when that realization settles, even briefly, the mind no longer has a reason to stay awake. It can finally stop working. Not because everything is finished, but because you are done trying to finish everything tonight. 7. Attachment is subtle. When people hear the word attachment, they usually think of obvious desire, wanting someone to stay, wanting something to succeed, wanting life to feel a certain way. But this is only the most visible layer. The Buddha spoke about attachment as something far more subtle, far more pervasive, and far more exhausting than simple wanting. Attachment is not only about what you crave, it is also about what you fear. It is about what you try to prevent, what you rehearse in your mind, and what you believe must not happen. The mind clings just as tightly to avoidance as it does to pursuit. In many cases, it clings even more. This is why restlessness often feels confusing. You may not be longing for anything in particular, yet the mind refuses to settle. You may not be chasing pleasure, yet there is a constant background tension. That tension comes from subtle attachment, the kind that does not announce itself as desire, but operates quietly as vigilance. The mind stays active not only because it wants something, but because it is trying to make sure something does not happen. It replays conversations to avoid regret. It imagines futures to prevent loss. It analyzes emotions to avoid discomfort. None of this feels like desire, but all of it is attachment. The Buddha described this as craving for becoming and craving for non-becoming, wanting things to turn out a certain way and wanting certain outcomes never to occur. Both forms keep the mind locked in management mode. Both create a sense that the present moment is insufficient and must be adjusted. This adjustment never ends. Subtle attachment is difficult to recognize because it disguises itself as responsibility. The mind says it is only being careful, only being prepared, only being realistic. But beneath these justifications is the same belief, that the moment is not safe unless it is controlled. This belief keeps the nervous system alert even when nothing is happening. Notice how often the mind scans for problems when you lie down to rest. It is not always searching for pleasure. More often, it is searching for threats. Threats to identity, threats to stability, threats to meaning. This scanning feels necessary, but it is learned. It is not an inherent function of awareness. It is a habit reinforced over time. The Buddha did not teach people to eliminate desire by force. He taught them to see desire clearly, including the desire to avoid. When desire is seen clearly, it loosens. Not because it is condemned, but because its function is understood. The function of subtle attachment is to create a sense of control. The mind believes that if it keeps thinking, planning, and monitoring, it can prevent suffering. But this belief is flawed. Much of suffering arises precisely because of this constant monitoring. The effort to prevent pain becomes a source of pain itself. This is especially visible at night. During the day, activity distracts the mind from its own habits. At night, when external demands fade, the internal habits become obvious. The mind does not suddenly become problematic at night. It simply loses its distractions. Subtle attachment reveals itself as an inability to let the moment be as it is. There is always a slight push, a subtle adjustment, an internal suggestion that something should be different. This push does not feel dramatic. It feels normal. That is why it is so powerful. The Buddha pointed out that attachment does not require strong emotion to operate. It can exist as a quiet preference, a mild resistance, or a barely noticeable tension. These small movements accumulate. Over time, they create a state of constant readiness that never allows deep rest. Letting go at this level does not mean suppressing desire or forcing acceptance. It means recognizing when the mind is trying to manage outcomes unnecessarily. It means noticing the subtle impulse to fix, prevent, or optimize the present moment. When you notice this impulse without acting on it, something begins to change. The mind expects that if it stops managing, something bad will happen. This expectation is rarely examined. It is assumed. But when you allow the impulse to manage to pass without obeying it, you gather evidence. Evidence that nothing collapses. Evidence that life continues. Evidence that safety does not depend on constant adjustment. This evidence weakens attachment more effectively than any argument. The Buddha emphasized that craving feeds on attention, not on force, not on intensity. Attention is the fuel. When attention stops circling around avoidance and desire, attachment loses energy. It does not need to be defeated. It fades when not fed. This is why rest is not created by effort. Effort is another form of attachment. Rest appears when effort is no longer justified. Subtle attachment often hides behind identity. The mind believes it must keep thinking in order to be someone competent, someone responsible, someone prepared. Letting go of subtle attachment can feel like letting go of yourself. This fear keeps the habit alive. But what actually happens is not loss, it is relief. The burden of maintaining an identity loosens. The pressure to perform internally diminishes. The mind no longer needs to prove its usefulness by staying busy. This does not make you careless. It makes you rested. When attachment softens, the present moment becomes sufficient. Not perfect, not ideal, but sufficient. There is no urgent need to escape it or improve it. This sufficiency is what allows the nervous system to downshift. The Buddha did not promise a life without desire. He promised freedom from compulsion. Desire may still arise, but it does not have to dictate behavior. Avoidance may still appear, but it does not have to dominate attention. This distinction matters. Freedom is not the absence of mental movement. It is the absence of enslavement to mental movement. As subtle attachment loosens, you may notice that thoughts still appear, but they feel less sticky. They do not demand immediate response. They do not pull attention as strongly. There is more space between impulse and action. In that space, rest becomes possible. For this moment, nothing needs to be prevented. Nothing needs to be secured. Nothing needs to be managed into a better shape. The present moment is allowed to exist without correction. This allowance is not resignation, it is understanding. Understanding that much of the mind's activity is unnecessary and that safety does not require constant supervision. When you stop trying to make the moment different, the moment softens on its own. Subtle attachment thrives on the belief that something is at stake right now. Letting go begins when that belief is questioned, not intellectually, but experientially. When you allow the moment to be as it is and notice that nothing breaks, the grip loosens naturally. This is why the Buddha emphasized direct seeing over belief. You do not need to convince yourself that letting go is safe. You need to experience it. As attachment fades, even slightly, the body responds. Muscles release. Breathing deepens. Mental noise loses its edge. These changes are not caused by technique. They are the natural effects of no longer being on guard. For rest to arrive, the mind does not need to stop wanting. It needs to stop insisting. It needs to stop believing that the present moment must be negotiated before it can be accepted. For now, nothing needs to become anything else. Nothing needs to be avoided. Nothing needs to be improved. When this is seen clearly, even for a moment, the endless inner movement begins to slow. Not because desire disappeared, but because the mind finally realized it does not need to keep pushing or pulling reality in order to be safe. And in that realization, rest finds you on its own. 8. The body knows how to rest. The mind often assumes it is responsible for rest. It believes that relaxation must be directed, managed, or achieved through the right method. Breathing must be controlled. Muscles must be intentionally released. Awareness must be placed in the correct way. This belief keeps the mind involved long after involvement is necessary. But the body does not need instruction to rest. It never did. Long before you learned how to think, your body already knew how to sleep, recover, and regulate itself. As an infant, there was no technique, no effort, no strategy. Rest happened because the conditions were right, not because the mind intervened. That intelligence has not disappeared. It has simply been overshadowed by control. Buddhist teaching points repeatedly to this truth. The body operates according to natural laws, not mental commands. Breath breathes itself. The heart beats without supervision. Healing occurs without instruction. Rest is part of the same intelligence. The problem is not that the body forgot how to rest. The problem is that the mind does not trust it to do so. This mistrust creates interference. The mind watches the body closely, checking whether it is relaxed enough, whether breathing is deep enough, whether sleep is approaching quickly enough. Each check is subtle, but together they keep the nervous system alert. The body receives mixed signals. On one hand, it is told to rest. On the other, it senses monitoring. Monitoring signals danger. The Buddha observed that when awareness becomes entangled with control, the body cannot settle fully. True rest requires the absence of supervision, not neglect, but non-interference. This is why rest often arrives unexpectedly, in moments when attention drifts, when you stop trying to relax, when you forget about your body altogether. The body seizes those moments and returns to balance on its own. Trying to relax the body is often the fastest way to prevent it. Notice how tension dissolves naturally when you are absorbed in something simple, a familiar sound, a repetitive movement, a gentle rhythm. You are not commanding muscles to release. You are not directing breath. The body responds to the absence of mental pressure. This response is immediate because it is innate. The Buddha did not instruct people to manipulate the body aggressively. He emphasized awareness that does not interfere, awareness that observes without correcting. When observation replaces management, the body returns to its natural state. The body is not tense by default. It becomes tense in response to perceived threat. That threat does not have to be physical. It can be psychological. The belief that something must be controlled, solved, or anticipated is enough to keep the body guarded. When that belief softens, the body releases its armor. This release does not need to be initiated. It happens automatically. The nervous system shifts from sympathetic activation to parasympathetic restoration. Muscles loosen, digestion improves, breathing slows. These changes are not techniques, they are biological responses to safety. The Buddha understood safety not as the absence of danger, but as the absence of clinging. When clinging ends, the body receives a clear message. It is no longer needed to protect a fragile identity. It can return to maintenance mode. Many people try to rest by focusing intensely on the body. They scan for tension. They instruct muscles to soften. They control breath patterns. While this can help temporarily, it often reinforces the belief that rest requires constant direction. The moment attention slips, tension returns. True rest does not depend on attention, it depends on trust. Trust allows the body to resume its role without interference. The body does not need to be told how to breathe deeply. It does so naturally when it senses safety. It does not need to be told how to sleep. It enters sleep when conditions allow. Those conditions are not created by effort. They are created by the absence of effort. This is why the Buddha placed such emphasis on non-doing, not as passivity, but as alignment. When you stop trying to correct the body, you align with its intelligence. Consider how quickly the body responds to permission. When you give yourself permission to stop holding, muscles release. When you stop monitoring breath, it deepens. When you stop checking for sleep, drowsiness increases. These shifts are not subtle, they are immediate. The body has been waiting for the mind to get out of the way. This does not mean the mind is an enemy. It means the mind has overextended its role. It has taken responsibility for processes that function better without it. The Buddha did not reject the mind. He taught it to know when to step aside. The body does not measure progress. It does not evaluate performance. It does not judge how well you are resting. Those judgments belong to the mind, and they interfere with rest. When judgment stops, the body relaxes more deeply. You do not need to check whether your shoulders are dropping. They will drop when the body feels safe. You do not need to control breathing. Breath will find its rhythm when interference ends. You do not need to guide yourself into sleep. Sleep will arrive when the body is allowed to take over. This allowance is subtle but powerful. The Buddha taught that awareness can be gentle. It does not need to be sharp or directive. Gentle awareness does not prod the body. It allows it to unfold. When awareness becomes permissive rather than corrective, the body begins to trust the present moment. That trust allows rest to deepen naturally. For this moment, the body does not need instruction. It does not need fixing. It does not need improvement. It knows exactly how to return to balance. Your only role is to stop interrupting. As the mind releases its grip, the body responds immediately. Not because it was broken, but because it was restrained. Rest is not something you impose on the body. It is something you allow. The Buddha did not teach people to override their nature. He taught them to return to it. The body has always known how to rest. It has simply been waiting for permission to do what it does best. And when that permission is given, without condition, without monitoring, without expectation, rest deepens on its own. Not because you made it happen, but because you finally allowed it. 9. Peace is not an experience. The mind is conditioned to seek peace the same way it seeks pleasure. It imagines peace as a state that must be reached, a feeling that must appear, or an experience that will finally confirm that everything is okay. Calm, warmth, stillness, bliss. These are the images the mind holds when it thinks of peace. This expectation quietly creates restlessness. The Buddha did not teach peace as a feeling to be achieved. He pointed to peace as what remains when craving ends. This distinction matters deeply. Feelings come and go. They are unreliable. If peace depends on a feeling, then peace will always be fragile. The moment you search for peace as an experience, you turn it into another object of desire. Desire activates effort. Effort creates tension. Tension prevents rest. The very act of searching for peace pushes it further away. This is why people often feel more agitated the harder they try to calm down. The mind believes it is moving toward peace, but it is actually reinforcing the habit of seeking. Seeking implies lack. Lack implies dissatisfaction. Dissatisfaction fuels movement. Peace cannot coexist with movement toward peace. In Buddhist understanding, peace is not something that appears. It is something that is uncovered. It does not arrive as a sensation. It reveals itself as the absence of compulsion. Compulsion is what drives the mind to constantly adjust the present moment. Adjusting is subtle. It can look like improvement, refinement, or spiritual effort. But underneath, it is the same message. This moment is not enough. As long as that message is believed, peace remains unavailable. The Buddha observed that suffering is not caused by unpleasant experiences alone. it is caused by craving for experiences to be different. Pleasant experiences are craved to continue. Unpleasant experiences are craved to end. Neutral experiences are craved to become meaningful. This constant craving keeps the mind in motion. Peace emerges when this movement stops. This does not mean pleasant feelings vanish. It means they are no longer required. Peace is no longer conditional. It does not depend on how you feel. This is why people can experience peace even in discomfort, and why people can feel restless even in comfort. Peace is not about the content of experience. It is about the absence of demand placed on experience. The mind struggles with this because it wants confirmation. It wants to feel peace in order to believe it is peaceful. But Buddhism points out that this need for confirmation is itself a form of craving. True peace does not announce itself. It does not feel dramatic. It often feels ordinary, so ordinary that the mind overlooks it. Peace is what remains when you stop asking, "Is this working?" That question alone reactivates the search. The Buddha did not instruct people to chase bliss. He warned against attachment to pleasant states. Pleasant states pass. Attachment to them creates suffering when they fade. Peace does not fade because it is not a state. It is a condition, the condition of non-clinging. When clinging ends, peace is already present, not as a sensation, but as ease. Ease in not having to manage the moment. Ease in not needing the moment to justify itself. This is especially important in rest and sleep. Many people lie awake searching for the feeling of sleepiness. They scan their body for heaviness. They monitor their mind for quiet. This monitoring keeps the system awake. Sleep does not arrive as an experience you detect. It arrives as the absence of detection. The moment you stop checking whether peace is present, peace has space to reveal itself. The Buddha emphasized letting go of the desire for results, not because results are bad, but because the desire for them interferes with natural processes. Peace, like sleep, is a natural process. It does not respond to pressure. The mind often asks, "How will I know I'm at peace?" That question is the problem. Peace does not need to be known. It needs to be allowed. Knowing requires awareness to stay active. Allowing permits awareness to soften. This is why deep peace often feels like fading, not gaining something, but losing interest in gaining. The urgency drains away. The push toward improvement relaxes. Nothing special replaces it. The Buddha called this the end of becoming, the end of striving to become something else. When becoming ends, being is sufficient. Peace is not exciting. It does not stimulate. It does not reward effort. This is why the mind often overlooks it. The mind is drawn to intensity. Peace is gentle, quiet, unimpressive, and yet it is what allows the system to rest. When you stop treating peace as an experience to be achieved, you stop searching for it. When searching ends, the agitation that accompanied searching ends as well. What remains is not a feeling you can point to. It is a lack of urgency, a lack of inner negotiation, a lack of resistance to what is. This lack is peace. The Buddha did not promise a constant pleasant state. He promised freedom from the need for constant pleasant states. That freedom is what makes peace stable. For this moment, you do not need to feel calm. You do not need to feel still. You do not need to feel peaceful. You only need to stop requiring any feeling to validate the moment. When that requirement drops, something subtle happens. The mind stops leaning forward. Attention softens. The body responds. Peace does not enter. It reveals itself. Not because you found it, but because you stopped pushing past it. And in that quiet absence of striving, rest deepens naturally. not as an experience to be noticed, but as a condition in which nothing needs to happen. 10 time is a mental construct. The mind experiences restlessness largely through time. It moves backward into memory and forward into imagination, rarely staying with what is actually happening. This movement creates the sense of duration, pressure, and urgency that keeps the mind awake. Without this movement, time loses its grip. The Buddha did not describe time as an enemy, but he clearly saw how identification with time generates suffering. The past and the future exist only as thoughts appearing in the present. Yet the mind treats them as real locations it must visit and manage. This treatment creates exhaustion. Notice how the mind behaves when you try to rest. It revisits moments that are already over, replaying conversations, decisions, and outcomes. It then jumps ahead, anticipating what must be done, what could go wrong, or what might happen. This back-and-forth motion never reaches a conclusion. It only sustains itself. The present moment is rarely the source of distress. Distress arises from mentally leaving it. The Buddha emphasized present awareness not as a technique to anchor attention, but as a recognition of what is already true. There is only the immediacy of sensation, perception, and awareness happening now. The past is a memory appearing now. The future is an image appearing now. When this is seen clearly, the weight of time begins to lift. Time feels heavy when the mind believes it must move through it, manage it, or prepare for it. It feels light when attention rests where experience is actually occurring. This resting is not an action. It is what happens when mental travel slows. The mind often believes it must stay active to prepare for what comes next. This belief is especially strong at night. When external cues fade, the mind takes on the role of timekeeper, planner, and protector. It stays alert to prevent future problems that are not yet real. This vigilance is learned. It is not necessary. The Buddha observed that awareness does not need to travel through time to function. Sensation occurs now. Breathing occurs now. Fatigue occurs now. Sleep occurs when awareness stops tracking time and allows itself to fade. Sleep does not happen in the future. It happens when the future is no longer being imagined. This is why monitoring the clock makes sleep more difficult. Each check reinforces the belief that time is running out or being wasted. This belief activates urgency. Urgency keeps the nervous system alert. When attention disengages from time, urgency dissolves. The body does not experience time the way the mind does. It experiences rhythms, breath cycles, heartbeats, sensations. These rhythms do not require measurement. They unfold naturally. When awareness aligns with these rhythms, the sense of time weakens. The Buddha pointed to impermanence not to create anxiety, but to dissolve attachment to duration. Everything changes, nothing stays. This includes mental states, emotions, and thoughts. When the mind stops trying to hold them, it stops trying to time them. The sense of time passing is closely tied to identity. The mind measures time in relation to the self. How long something lasted, how much time is left, how old you are, what stage you are in. This measurement keeps identity active. When identity softens, time softens with it. This is why moments of deep absorption feel timeless. When the self is not being referenced, time disappears. Not because it stops existing, but because it is no longer being tracked. The Buddha did not instruct people to eliminate time. He showed them how to stop being dominated by it. When attention rests with what is, rather than what was or will be, time loses its authority. This does not require effort. Effort pulls attention into the future, worry pulls it forward, regret pulls it backward. Non-interference allows attention to settle where it already is. As attention settles, the sense of duration changes. Moments stretch or collapse, boundaries blur. This is not something you cause. It happens naturally when time is no longer being referenced. Sleep arrives when the mind stops narrating time, when it stops marking progress, when it stops asking how long it has been or how long it will take. The Buddha understood that the mind's obsession with time is an attempt to create security. If time is measured, controlled, and planned, the self feels safer. But this safety is fragile. It requires constant mental activity. True safety does not come from controlling time. It comes from releasing the need to control it. For this moment, there is nowhere to go. Nothing is waiting. Nothing is late. The present moment does not need to lead anywhere. When the mind stops traveling, the body relaxes, breathing deepens, awareness narrows, the edges of experience soften. These are signs that time is losing its grip. Sleep does not occur at a certain time. It occurs when time is forgotten. The Buddha did not teach people to escape time. He taught them to stop identifying with it. When identification loosens, time becomes a neutral concept rather than a source of pressure. For now, the past does not require review. The future does not require preparation. This moment does not need to justify itself. When these demands drop, awareness no longer has a reason to stay sharp. It can soften, it can blur, it can fade. And as time dissolves from attention, sleep no longer feels distant. It feels immediate. Not because you reached it, but because nothing is pulling you away from it anymore. 11. The self fades naturally. The mind is taught to believe that the self must be protected, that identity is something fragile that requires constant reinforcement. Thoughts, memories, preferences, and roles are woven together into a sense of me, and the mind spends enormous energy maintaining this structure. It checks whether the self is intact, respected, understood, and secure. This maintenance is exhausting. The Buddha did not describe the self as something that needs to be destroyed. He described it as something that is not as solid as it appears. The self is not an object, it is a process. A pattern of attention that repeats so often, it feels permanent. When attention rests, the pattern weakens. This fading is not something you cause. It is something that happens when effort ends. The self does not disappear through force. It dissolves when it is no longer being reinforced. Most people fear this dissolution because they associate it with loss. They imagine that without a strong sense of self, they will become passive, careless, or empty. This fear keeps the mind active. It resists rest because rest allows identity to loosen. But observe what actually happens when the self fades, even briefly. In moments of deep relaxation, absorption, or near sleep, the sense of me softens. You are not thinking about who you are. You are not defending your position. You are not narrating your life. And yet, nothing is lost. Life continues without commentary. The Buddha pointed to this directly. He observed that suffering arises from clinging to the idea of a permanent self. When that idea loosens, suffering lessens. Not because experience becomes perfect, but because it is no longer filtered through constant self-reference. Self-reference keeps the nervous system alert. It asks, what does this mean about me? How does this affect me? What should I do about this? These questions never end. They keep attention circling identity. When attention stops circling, the self loses definition. This loss of definition is not annihilation, it is relief. The burden of maintaining a story drops. The pressure to be someone specific dissolves. There is less to defend, less to prove, less to control. The Buddha described this as freedom from identification, not freedom from existence. You do not stop existing. you stop constantly referring experience back to a central narrative. This is why deep rest feels impersonal, not cold, but spacious. Experience continues, but it is not owned. Sensations occur without commentary. Thoughts may appear, but they are not claimed. Awareness becomes simpler. The self fades naturally when attention stops feeding it. Feeding happens through repetition. Each time a thought is interpreted as mine, the self is reinforced. Each time a memory is replayed as a personal story, the self is strengthened. Each time a future is imagined as my future, the self becomes more solid. When these habits pause, even briefly, the self softens. This softening often occurs at night. As the mind becomes tired, its ability to maintain identity weakens. This is why the sense of self feels less defined just before sleep. The edges blur. Thoughts lose coherence. Personal concerns lose urgency. The mind often resists this phase because it feels like loss of control. It tries to reassert identity by thinking, planning, or worrying. This effort pulls awareness back into sharpness and delays rest. The Buddha understood this resistance. He did not encourage people to fight it. He encouraged them to recognize it. Recognition allows the habit to unwind without struggle. When you see that the self is fading naturally, there is no need to intervene. You do not need to hold on to it. You do not need to push it away. You allow it to soften as it wants to. This allowance creates deep rest. The fear that something essential will be lost is based on misunderstanding. What fades is not your capacity to function. It is the tension of self-maintenance. When that tension dissolves, functioning becomes easier, not harder. This is why people often wake from deep sleep feeling clearer. The self was offline for hours. Identity paused, and nothing was damaged. In fact, restoration occurred. The Buddha used this observation to point toward liberation. If the self can fade without harm in sleep, it is not as necessary as the mind believes. This realization weakens attachment. As the self fades, the need to manage experience fades with it. There is no one left who must control the moment. The body responds immediately. It relaxes. The breath deepens. Awareness narrows. This narrowing is not constriction. It is simplification. Experience becomes less cluttered by interpretation. The Buddha did not teach people to get rid of themselves. He taught them to stop clinging to an idea of themselves. The difference is subtle, but essential. For this moment, you do not need to remember who you are. You do not need to perform your role. You do not need to maintain your story. You are allowed to exist without identity. As attention softens, the self continues to fade. Not abruptly, not dramatically, gently, like a shape dissolving into shadow. There is no danger here. Nothing needs to be held. Nothing needs to be protected. The fading of the self is not disappearance. It is the absence of unnecessary effort. And when that effort ends, rest deepens beyond anything the mind could create intentionally. Not because you became something else, but because you finally stopped trying to be someone. 12. Nothing is missing. Restlessness is often fueled by a quiet, persistent belief that something essential is absent. The mind scans experience as if searching for a missing piece, something that would finally make the moment complete. This search is rarely conscious. It appears as unease, dissatisfaction, or a subtle feeling that the present moment is not quite enough. The Buddha identified this sense of lack as a core driver of suffering, not because things are objectively missing, but because the mind believes they are. This belief keeps attention moving, evaluating, comparing, and seeking. As long as the mind is searching for completion, rest remains unavailable. The belief that something is missing is not based on evidence. It is a habit of perception. From early on, the mind learns to measure experience against expectation. If reality does not match the image it holds, it concludes that something is lacking. This conclusion becomes automatic. The mind rarely questions it. It simply assumes that fulfillment exists somewhere else, at some other time, or in some other condition. This assumption creates endless movement. The Buddha did not deny that pain, loss, or discomfort exist. He pointed out that the sense of incompleteness added on top of them is unnecessary. Pain does not require the belief that something is missing. That belief intensifies suffering and prolongs it. The mind often believes that peace will come when the missing piece is found, a better understanding, a resolved relationship, a clearer future, a different version of oneself. These imagined completions keep the mind oriented toward elsewhere, but elsewhere never arrives. Each time one condition is met, another appears. The mind moves the goalpost because the habit of seeking is stronger than any particular object of seeking. This is why fulfillment based on acquisition never lasts. The Buddha's insight was simple and radical. Completeness is not achieved. It is recognized when grasping ends. This recognition does not come from convincing yourself that nothing is missing. It comes from noticing that the sense of lack is a mental movement, not a fact. When you stop treating it as true, it loses its grip. Notice how the belief, something is missing, affects the body. There is tension, a slight leaning forward, an inability to settle. This physical response reveals the cost of the belief. The body prepares to search, to reach, to adjust. When the belief softens, the body relaxes. This relaxation is not caused by acquiring something. It is caused by stopping the search. The Buddha taught that craving arises from ignorance. Ignorance not as lack of intelligence, but as misperception. The mind misperceives the present moment as insufficient. This misperception keeps the cycle of seeking alive. When the misperception is seen clearly, craving weakens. Nothing is missing does not mean everything is perfect. It means that perfection is not required for rest. It means that the present moment does not need to justify itself. This is difficult for the mind to accept because it has been trained to improve, optimize, and complete. Improvement has its place, but when applied to rest, it becomes an obstacle. Rest does not improve the moment, it allows it. The Buddha did not promise that life would always feel satisfying. He pointed out that satisfaction does not depend on life feeling a certain way. It depends on the absence of demand placed on life. When the demand for completeness drops, experience becomes sufficient. This sufficiency does not announce itself as pleasure. It feels like relief. Relief from the pressure to find something else. Relief from the belief that this moment must become different in order to be acceptable. Many people resist this idea because they confuse acceptance with resignation. But acceptance in Buddhism is not giving up. It is stopping the unnecessary fight with reality. The belief that something is missing is often tied to identity. The mind believes that if something is missing, then the self is incomplete. This belief drives constant self-improvement and self-evaluation. While growth can be healthy, the underlying belief of deficiency creates chronic tension. The Buddha offered a different perspective. The self is not incomplete, it is impermanent. It does not need completion because it is not a fixed thing. When identity is seen as fluid, the need to complete it fades. This realization allows the mind to rest without waiting for fulfillment. For this moment, nothing needs to be added. Nothing needs to arrive. Nothing needs to be fixed. The moment is allowed to be exactly as it is, without being measured against an ideal. This allowance does not stop life from changing. Change continues naturally, but the mind no longer chases change as a solution to discomfort. The sense of lack often returns quietly. It may whisper that something important is still missing. When this happens, you do not need to argue with it. Arguing is engagement. You simply notice it as a habit. Habits lose power when they are seen clearly. The Buddha emphasized awareness not as concentration, but as clarity. Clarity reveals when the mind is adding unnecessary conclusions to experience. The conclusion, something is missing, is one of the most powerful. When that conclusion is released, even briefly, the body responds immediately. Breathing slows, muscles soften, mental noise loses urgency. This response is not mystical, it is biological. The nervous system exits search mode. Rest arrives when the search ends. Nothing is missing does not mean you will never want anything again. It means that wanting is no longer required for the moment to be livable. The Buddha did not teach people to deny desire. He taught them to stop believing that desire must be fulfilled in order for peace to exist. For now, you do not need fulfillment. You do not need confirmation. You do not need reassurance. You are allowed to rest without being complete. When the belief in lack fades, the mind stops reaching forward. It no longer leans into the future. It settles into what is already here. And in that settling, rest deepens naturally. Not because something arrived, but because the search finally ended. 13. Allow unconsciousness. One of the quiet fears beneath restlessness is the fear of losing awareness. The mind has learned to equate being awake with being safe. Attention feels like protection. Consciousness feels like control. When awareness begins to dim, the mind often reacts by tightening, as if something essential is slipping away. This reaction is rarely conscious. It shows up as a sudden surge of thoughts, a reflex to check the body, or a renewed effort to stay alert. Just as the edge of sleep approaches, the mind pulls itself back. Not because it wants to stay awake, but because it does not trust what happens when awareness fades. The Buddha understood this fear deeply. He did not describe unconsciousness as a threat. He observed it as a natural and necessary state. Every night, consciousness dissolves. Every night, the sense of self loosens. And every morning, awareness returns without harm. The evidence is clear. Yet, the fear persists. The fear is not of sleep itself. It is the fear of not being present to monitor experience. The mind believes that if it is not watching, something could go wrong. This belief keeps vigilance alive long after it is useful. Allowing unconsciousness means allowing awareness to blur without resisting it. It does not mean forcing sleep. It means removing the reflex to stay sharp. This reflex is learned. It is reinforced by a culture that values alertness, productivity, and control. Letting awareness fade feels irresponsible to a mind trained to equate value with vigilance. But rest requires the opposite. The Buddha did not teach people to cling to consciousness. He taught them to see its impermanence. Awareness arises. Awareness fades. This movement is natural. Suffering arises when the mind resists one phase and clings to another. When you allow unconsciousness, you stop resisting impermanence. Notice how the body responds when awareness softens. Sensations become diffuse, thoughts lose structure, images fragment. This is not failure, it is transition. The system is shifting from monitoring mode to restoration mode. The mind often tries to interrupt this transition by checking in. Am I still awake? Am I falling asleep? Is this working? Each check pulls awareness back into sharpness. Each one delays rest. The Buddha would describe this as grasping at consciousness. Grasping does not always reach outward. Sometimes it reaches inward, holding on to clarity, identity, and awareness itself. This inward grasping is subtle, but it is powerful. Allowing unconsciousness means releasing this inward grasp. This release does not happen through command. You cannot order yourself to become unconscious, but you can stop ordering yourself to remain conscious. There is a difference. When the mind stops insisting on clarity, clarity fades naturally. When it stops insisting on awareness, awareness narrows on its own. This narrowing is not loss, it is function. The system is doing what it is designed to do. The Buddha observed that deep rest restores not by adding something, but by removing something. Removing effort, removing vigilance, removing self-monitoring. Unconsciousness is not emptiness. It is not annihilation. It is a pause in narration. The story of self stops running. The commentary ends. The body repairs itself without interference. This pause is healing. Many people fear unconsciousness because they associate it with death. But Buddhism does not frame death as disappearance. It frames it as change. Sleep is a small, harmless example of this change. Consciousness alters form. It does not vanish. When you allow unconsciousness, you practice non-resistance to change. The mind often asks, "Who will be here if awareness fades?" That question assumes someone must be present. But presence does not require a watcher. Life continues without supervision. The heart beats, the lungs breathe, cells repair, all without awareness. The Buddha pointed to this to show that control is largely an illusion. Much of life functions perfectly without conscious involvement. Rest requires trusting this fact. Trust is not belief, it is allowance. Allowing unconsciousness means letting go of the need to witness every moment. It means letting the body take over without interference. It means accepting that awareness does not need to be continuous to be safe. This acceptance feels subtle. It feels like giving up a small internal tension you did not realize you were holding. When that tension releases, the system responds immediately. Thoughts fragment, attention narrows, the sense of location blurs. These are signs that resistance is ending. The Buddha did not encourage people to stay awake at all costs. He encouraged them to let go of what binds them. Clinging to consciousness is one of those bindings. When you stop clinging, the transition into sleep becomes smooth rather than abrupt. There is no struggle, no sudden drop. Awareness simply thins and fades. You do not cross into unconsciousness. You drift into it. This drifting cannot be observed without interrupting it. Observation keeps awareness sharp. Allowance lets it soften. For this moment, you do not need to witness the process. You do not need to remember anything. You do not need to stay present. Presence is not lost when awareness fades. It changes form. When the need to monitor dissolves, the body receives a clear signal. There is no threat. There is no demand. There is no requirement to stay alert. Rest deepens. The Buddha did not teach people to fear the fading of consciousness. He showed them that clinging to it is unnecessary. When clinging ends, fading happens naturally. Allow unconsciousness the same way you allow exhalation. You do not push it. You stop holding your breath. As awareness softens, effort dissolves with it. The last layer of resistance releases. And in that release, sleep no longer feels like something you fall into. It feels like something you finally stop avoiding. Not because you forced it, but because you allowed awareness to rest. 15. Nothing more is required. At a certain point, the mind runs out of arguments, not because every question has been answered, but because the energy to keep questioning has quietly drained away. This is the moment most people miss. They assume something else must still be done. One more insight, one more adjustment, one more letting go. But this assumption is just the habit of effort wearing a softer disguise. The Buddha pointed to a truth that is deeply uncomfortable for the striving mind. Liberation does not come from doing everything right. It comes from stopping when nothing more is needed. The mind is conditioned to believe that rest must be earned, that peace is conditional, that stillness arrives only after sufficient understanding, discipline, or spiritual progress. This belief keeps the system subtly tense, even in moments that could otherwise be restful. But look closely. What is actually required right now? You are breathing without instruction. The body is supported without effort. Awareness is present without command. Nothing essential is missing. Nothing essential is broken. Nothing essential is waiting for completion. The belief that something more is required is not based on reality. It is based on habit. A habit of improvement, a habit of fixing, a habit of believing that the present moment is never quite enough on its own. The Buddha described this habit as becoming, the endless movement toward a better moment, a better self, a better state. Becoming never rests because its fuel is dissatisfaction. Even when it reaches a pleasant state, it immediately looks beyond it. This is why rest cannot coexist with becoming. Nothing more is required means the process of becoming has paused. Not permanently, not dramatically, just enough for the system to rest. This pause is subtle. It does not feel like achievement. It feels like disinterest in continuing to push. The mind simply loses the urge to interfere. This loss of urge is not failure. It is wisdom. Wisdom recognizes when effort no longer serves. It recognizes when continuation is unnecessary. It recognizes that the present moment does not need to be improved in order to be livable. The Buddha did not tell people to stop living. He showed them how to stop forcing life into shapes it does not need to take. At this point, even listening is optional. Even understanding is optional. The mind does not need to hold on to these words. It does not need to remember them. Memory belongs to effort. Rest belongs to release. The moment you stop trying to apply the teaching has already done its work. This is difficult for the mind to accept because it feels too simple. The mind expects complexity. It expects a final instruction. It expects a decisive action that signals completion. But the Buddha's insight was that completion is not signaled. It is recognized in the absence of striving. Nothing more is required does not mean nothing will ever happen again. It means nothing needs to happen now. Now does not need justification. Now does not need direction. Now does not need improvement. When these demands fall away, awareness naturally narrows, attention softens, the edges of experience blur. This is not something you cause. It happens when the mind stops asking for more. The nervous system recognizes this immediately. Without demands, it exits readiness. Without goals, it releases tension. Without urgency, it allows restoration. This is why the deepest rest often feels like disappearance. Not disappearance of life, but disappearance of effort. The constant inner push dissolves, and what remains is simple being. The Buddha described this as cessation, not the cessation of existence, but the cessation of unnecessary activity, the stopping of what was never required in the first place. You may notice the mind trying one last time to engage, to review, to summarize, to remember. This is the habit of continuation. You do not need to stop it forcefully. Force is still effort. You simply do not need to follow it. When following ends, movement ends. Nothing more is required also means nothing needs to be avoided. You do not need to stay awake. You do not need to fall asleep. You do not need to reach silence. You do not need to maintain awareness. All of that assumes responsibility. You are not responsible for the next moment. The next moment arrives on its own. It always has. The Buddha trusted this. He trusted the natural unfolding of experience when clinging ceased. That trust allowed him to rest in stillness without effort. You do not need to trust perfectly. You only need to stop distrusting enough to let go. For this moment, you can put everything down. Not because it is resolved, not because it is understood, but because it does not need to be carried right now. When carrying ends, rest is inevitable. Silence does not need to be entered. It is already here beneath the movement of mind. When movement stops, silence remains. Sleep does not need to be reached. It arrives when nothing is resisting it. Nothing more is required is not a command. It is a description of reality when effort ends. And when that reality is allowed, without analysis, without confirmation, without one last attempt to improve it, the mind finally releases its grip, not with effort, not with intention, but with relief, because it realizes, at last, that it was never required to do anything more. 16. Silence is what remains. The mind often believes silence is something it must enter, as if it were a place separate from where you are now. It imagines silence as a destination reached only after thoughts stop, emotions settle, and awareness becomes pure. This belief turns silence into another goal, and goals keep the mind moving. But silence is not somewhere you go. It is what remains when you stop leaving. The Buddha did not teach silence as an altered state. He pointed to it as the natural condition beneath activity. Thoughts move across it. Sensations arise within it. Emotions ripple through it. But silence itself is never disturbed. It is not created by removing noise. It is revealed when resistance to noise ends. This is difficult to grasp because the mind equates silence with absence. Absence of thought, absence of sound, absence of experience. But Buddhist silence is not empty in that way. It is full, steady, and unmoving. It does not oppose experience. It holds it. When you stop trying to quiet the mind, silence becomes obvious. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, simply present. It has always been here, unnoticed, because attention was constantly chasing movement. Notice this carefully. Even when thoughts are active, there is something that is not moving. Even when the body shifts, there is something stable. Even when sound appears, there is a background that does not react. That background is silence. The Buddha pointed to this not to give people something new, but to help them stop overlooking what was already there. The overlooking happens because the mind is trained to value movement. Change feels meaningful. Stillness feels empty. So attention follows what changes and ignores what remains. Rest requires reversing this habit. Silence does not demand attention. It does not advertise itself. It does not compete with thought. This is why it is missed. The mind is drawn to activity because activity promises resolution, identity, and control. Silence promises none of these. Silence offers no reassurance. That is precisely why it is freeing. When you allow everything to be exactly as it is, without trying to improve it or escape it, silence becomes unavoidable. It is what experience rests in. It is what allows experience to come and go. The Buddha described this as the unconditioned, not something produced by conditions, but something that remains regardless of conditions. Thoughts are conditioned. Emotions are conditioned. Sensations are conditioned. Silence is not. This does not mean silence is mystical or special. It means it is fundamental. As effort fades, attention naturally widens. When attention widens, it stops clinging to individual thoughts. When clinging ends, movement loses its urgency. In that loss of urgency, silence becomes felt. Not as an experience you can point to, but as an absence of friction. The mind often tries to confirm silence. Is this it? Am I silent now? The moment it asks, attention contracts again. This is not a failure. It is just habit reasserting itself. You do not need to correct it. Correction is movement. Silence does not require protection. Even if thoughts return, silence is unchanged. Even if the body moves, silence remains. Even if awareness fades into sleep, silence does not disappear. Sleep is silence experienced without commentary. This is why deep rest feels like merging rather than arriving. There is no threshold, no crossing point. Activity simply dissolves back into what was always holding it. The Buddha did not teach people to hold on to silence. Holding is another form of clinging. Silence cannot be held because it is not an object. It is what remains when holding ends. When you stop trying to stay aware, silence deepens. When you stop trying to understand, silence stabilizes. When you stop trying to remember, silence absorbs experience. At this stage, even intention relaxes. There is no longer a need to guide the process. Guidance implies direction. Silence has no direction. You may notice that effort has almost completely drained away. Thoughts may still flicker, but they feel distant. The sense of being someone doing something is faint. This is not emptiness, it is simplicity. The Buddha described this simplicity as peace beyond conditions. Peace not dependent on outcomes, sensations, or understanding. Peace that does not fluctuate because it is not built on change. Silence is not fragile. It does not need perfect circumstances. It does not disappear when attention wavers. It only seems absent when the mind is too busy to notice it. For now, nothing needs to be added. Nothing needs to be removed. Nothing needs to be watched. Experience is free to slow down on its own. Awareness is free to narrow. The body is free to let go completely. Silence is not something you enter at the end of the path. It is what remains when the path is no longer being walked. And when walking stops, when effort dissolves, when the last need to adjust fades away, silence is not found. It is recognized, because it was never absent, only overlooked. 17 Rest does not belong to you. One of the final attachments the mind holds is the belief that rest is something personal, something you must achieve, something that happens to you because you did something right or failed to do something wrong. This belief keeps a subtle sense of ownership alive even after effort has largely dissolved. The mind still wants credit or blame. It wants to know whether it rested properly, whether it slept well enough, whether it let go deeply enough. This evaluation quietly reactivates identity, and where identity reappears, tension follows. The Buddha did not describe rest as a personal accomplishment. He did not frame peace as something the self attains. He pointed to rest as something impersonal, something that happens when conditions align and interference ends. Rest does not belong to you in the same way breathing does not belong to you. Breathing happens through you, not because of you. Sleep happens through you, not because you caused it. Silence happens through you, not because you earned it. When the mind believes rest is personal, it treats it as fragile. It worries about losing it. It tries to preserve it. It monitors it. This monitoring keeps a thin layer of vigilance alive. True rest has no owner. Ownership implies responsibility. Responsibility implies effort. Effort implies tension. Removing ownership removes the entire chain. The Buddha emphasized non-self, not as a philosophy, but as a release from burden. When there is no owner, there is no one left who must manage the process. Rest can happen freely. This is why rest deepens when you stop caring whether you are resting. Caring seems harmless, even reasonable, but caring keeps attention active. It keeps the self involved. It keeps the mind slightly leaned forward, checking whether things are unfolding correctly. When that checking ends, rest becomes deeper than anything effort could produce. The mind may resist this idea. It may say that without ownership, nothing matters. But this is a misunderstanding. Non-ownership does not remove meaning, it removes strain. Experience still occurs. Sensations still arise. Life still moves. What disappears is the pressure to control it. The Buddha observed that suffering continues as long as there is someone who believes they must hold life together. When that belief dissolves, life carries itself. Rest belongs to no one because there is no separate self required for it to occur. This realization often feels like relief mixed with unfamiliarity. The mind is used to being involved. Stepping aside feels strange at first, but the body responds immediately. Without mental supervision, it relaxes more deeply. Breathing becomes effortless. Muscles soften without instruction. Awareness narrows naturally. These are signs that ownership has loosened. The mind may try to reassert itself by asking whether this state will last. That question itself reveals lingering ownership. You do not need to answer it. Answering would bring you back into management mode. Rest does not need to last. It only needs to be allowed now. The Buddha did not teach people to secure peace. He taught them to stop clinging to it. Peace that must be secured is already unstable. When you stop claiming rest as yours, you stop protecting it. When you stop protecting it, it deepens. This is why the deepest sleep is dreamless. There is no one there to claim it, no one there to experience it, and yet restoration occurs completely. Non-ownership allows the same quality of rest even before sleep arrives. For this moment, rest does not need your involvement. You do not need to cooperate with it. You do not need to sustain it. You can step aside. The Buddha described this as relinquishment, not giving something up, but stepping out of the way, letting natural processes unfold without interference. When ownership dissolves, even subtly, the last layer of effort fades. There is nothing left to do, and no one left to do it. Rest continues on its own, not because you held on to it, but because you finally stopped claiming it. 18. There is no final step. The mind is deeply conditioned to believe that every process must end with a conclusion, a final insight, a decisive shift, a moment that signals completion. This belief is so ingrained that even rest is treated as a sequence that must arrive somewhere specific. The mind waits for a final step, convinced that only then will it be allowed to stop. This belief quietly prevents stopping. The Buddha did not describe liberation as a finish line. He did not present awakening as a dramatic endpoint that replaces confusion with permanent clarity. He pointed to something much simpler and much more unsettling for the striving mind. There is no final step because there is no journey in the way the mind imagines one. The idea of a final step keeps effort alive. It suggests that something essential is still ahead, still unresolved, still missing. As long as the mind believes this, it continues to lean forward. Leaning forward is tension. Tension is wakefulness. Rest begins when the leaning ends. The belief in a final step is comforting because it gives direction. It reassures the mind that progress is happening, but that reassurance comes at a cost. It keeps the mind invested in becoming, in improvement, in arrival. Buddhism does not feed this investment, it withdraws it. The Buddha observed that suffering continues as long as the mind is oriented toward becoming something else, becoming calmer, becoming wiser, becoming more detached, even becoming free. Becoming always implies that what is here is insufficient. When that implication drops, rest becomes possible. There is no final step because there is nothing to complete. There is only the cessation of unnecessary movement. Movement does not stop because it reaches a destination. It stops because the reason for moving disappears. The mind often resists this idea because it feels anticlimactic. It wants a moment of recognition, a clear marker that says, "Now you can stop." But stopping does not announce itself. It happens quietly, when the impulse to continue no longer makes sense. This is why rest often surprises people. It arrives when they give up trying to arrive. The Buddha did not teach people to abandon effort prematurely. He showed them how effort exhausts itself when it is seen clearly. When the mind recognizes that effort is no longer serving anything real, it lets go naturally. The idea of a final step is another form of control. It tries to organize rest into a sequence the mind can understand, but rest does not follow sequences, it follows release. Release does not require confirmation. It does not need to be noticed. In fact, noticing it too much interferes with it. This is especially important as awareness fades towards sleep. The mind often tries to track the process. It looks for signs. It wonders how close it is. This tracking is the belief in a final step operating in real time. Sleep does not come at the end of tracking. It comes when tracking stops. The Buddha understood that the mind's need for structure is useful in daily life, but harmful in moments of surrender. Surrender has no structure. It cannot be mapped. It cannot be completed. There is no last instruction to follow, no final adjustment to make, no ultimate insight required. When the mind stops expecting a conclusion, it stops straining toward one. That strain is often the last thing keeping awareness sharp. This is why rest deepens when you give up the idea that you are almost there. Almost there is still there. There is no arrival point because there is nowhere to arrive. Experience is already happening. Awareness is already present. Silence is already underneath movement. The only thing that changes is whether the mind keeps leaning forward. When leaning forward ends, nothing special happens. That is the point. The Buddha did not promise fireworks. He promised freedom from strain. Freedom from strain feels quiet, ordinary, unremarkable. That is why the mind often misses it. The absence of a final step means you are not behind. It means you are not failing to reach something. It means there was never a destination you were supposed to reach in the first place. This realization removes the last reason to hurry. For this moment, you do not need to finish anything. You do not need to arrive anywhere. You do not need to understand what comes next. There is no next that requires your involvement. When the expectation of a final step dissolves, the system relaxes completely. There is nothing left to prepare for, nothing left to anticipate, nothing left to complete. Awareness no longer has a task. Attention no longer has a direction. The body no longer has a reason to stay alert. This is not an ending, it is a stopping. The Buddha did not teach people how to reach the end. He taught them how to stop running. And when running stops, not because you decided to stop, but because there was no reason left to continue, rest becomes effortless. Not because you reached the final step, but because you finally saw that there never was one. 19 effort falls away on its own. The mind is deeply trained to believe that effort is what keeps life functioning. From early on, effort is praised, rewarded, and reinforced. Try harder, pay attention, stay focused. Make progress. Over time, effort becomes more than a tool, it becomes an identity. The mind begins to believe that without effort, everything would collapse. This belief follows people even into rest. When you lie down, the body may be still, but effort often continues quietly. Effort to relax, effort to let go, effort to stop thinking, effort to do nothing correctly. This effort is subtle, but it keeps the nervous system activated. The body cannot fully release while its senses demand. The Buddha did not teach effortlessness as something to be achieved through more effort. He observed that effort naturally falls away when it is no longer needed. Just as a hand releases when it realizes it is not holding anything, the mind releases effort when it sees there is nothing to manage. This seeing cannot be forced. It happens gradually as insight deepens. Effort exists because the mind believes something is at stake. Safety, identity, control. When that belief weakens, effort loses its justification. The mind does not need to be convinced to stop working. It stops working when it sees that work is unnecessary. This is why telling yourself to stop trying rarely works. The command itself is effort. It reinforces the belief that control is required. The Buddha pointed to a different approach. Understand the cost of effort clearly, and effort will exhaust itself. Notice how effort feels in the body. There is tension, a slight tightening, a readiness to intervene. Effort always has a physical signature. When effort is present, rest is partial. As understanding deepens, the mind begins to question the value of constant effort. It starts to notice that many things unfold without intervention. Breath continues, sensations shift, thoughts come and go. Life moves even when effort relaxes. This noticing weakens the belief that effort is essential. Effort does not end because you forbid it. It ends because it no longer makes sense. The mind stops investing energy in something that does not produce safety or relief. The Buddha emphasized right effort not as constant exertion, but as appropriate effort. Effort is useful when it serves a purpose. It becomes harmful when it continues out of habit. In rest, effort has no purpose. The mind may resist letting effort go because effort feels like protection. It feels like vigilance. Letting it drop can feel risky. But when effort softens even slightly, the body responds with relief. Muscles release. Breathing deepens. Mental urgency fades. These responses provide evidence. Evidence that effort was not protecting you, it was burdening you. This evidence is more persuasive than any teaching. As effort falls away, awareness changes quality. It becomes less sharp, less focused. The edges blur. Attention drifts. This drifting is not a mistake. It is a sign that the system is no longer maintaining alertness unnecessarily. The mind may try to reassert effort by checking whether this is okay. That checking is simply effort reappearing. You do not need to stop it. Stopping would be more effort. You only need to see it. Seeing is enough. When effort is seen clearly, without judgment, it weakens. Judgment adds energy. Understanding removes it. The Buddha described this process as dispassion. The mind loses interest in exertion. It sees that effort does not lead where it thought it would. Without interest, effort dissolves. This dissolution is quiet. It does not feel like an accomplishment. It feels like giving up something heavy you did not realize you were carrying. As effort falls away, there is nothing to replace it. No technique, no instruction, no method. That emptiness is unsettling at first, but it is also freeing. There is no longer anything to do. The system begins to rest deeply because there is no demand placed on it. Effortlessness does not mean passivity in life. It means rest is no longer contaminated by work. The body can restore itself fully because it is not being asked to perform. The Buddha did not promise a life without effort. He promised freedom from unnecessary effort. This freedom is what allows deep rest. For this moment, you do not need to try. You do not need to stop trying. You do not need to do effortlessness correctly. All of that would be effort. You only need to allow effort to reveal itself as unnecessary. When that realization settles, even faintly, effort loses its grip. And when effort falls away, rest remains. Not because you achieved it, but because nothing is holding it back anymore. 20. Nothing needs to be held. The last habit to release is holding attention, holding awareness, holding stillness, holding on to the idea that something important might slip away if you loosen your grip. This habit is so subtle that it often goes unnoticed. The mind believes it has already let go, yet something is still being maintained. Holding does not always feel like tension. Sometimes it feels like care, like attentiveness, like responsibility. But beneath it is the same assumption that something valuable requires guarding. The Buddha did not teach people to hold on to peace. He taught them to see that peace does not need protection. Anything that needs to be held is already unstable. Stability comes from non-clinging, not from grip. The mind holds because it believes release will lead to loss. Loss of clarity, loss of calm, loss of identity, loss of safety. This belief keeps the system subtly alert, even when everything appears quiet. Look closely at what is actually being held. It is not an object. It is not an experience. It is an idea. The idea that you must remain present in a particular way. That awareness must be maintained. That silence must be preserved. This idea is effort in disguise. When holding relaxes, there is a sense of dropping, not falling, but letting gravity do what it has always done. The system stops bracing. There is nothing to brace against. The Buddha pointed to this dropping as liberation from clinging, not dramatic release, but the end of unnecessary maintenance. Maintenance is exhausting. It requires constant checking, constant adjustment, constant reassurance. When nothing needs to be held, there is nothing to check. This is why the deepest rest feels like giving up completely, not in despair, but in trust. Trust that life continues without grip. Trust that awareness does not need to be preserved. Trust that silence does not disappear when you stop guarding it. The body understands this immediately. When holding ends, muscles soften more deeply than before. Breathing becomes effortless. The sense of being located somewhere dissolves. This dissolution can feel unfamiliar. The mind may briefly try to reassert holding, not because it is necessary, but because it is habitual. You do not need to stop this attempt. You simply do not need to follow it. When holding is seen clearly, it weakens. The Buddha emphasized letting go not as an action, but as a natural consequence of understanding. When you see that nothing is required to be held, the grip relaxes on its own. There is no need to force release. Forcing is holding with pressure. Release happens when pressure becomes pointless. At this stage, even awareness does not need to be held. Awareness can drift, it can narrow, it can fade. There is no instruction to maintain it. Maintenance belongs to effort. Effort belongs to clinging. When clinging ends, maintenance ends. Nothing needs to be held because nothing is at risk. Experience arises and passes according to its nature. Holding does not stabilize it. Holding only delays rest. The Buddha taught that peace is not fragile. It does not need protection. It is not damaged by distraction. It is not lost when awareness fades. It remains as the ground beneath experience. This is why sleep restores. In sleep, nothing is held, the grip is completely gone, and yet nothing essential is lost. On the contrary, the system heals. You do not need to wait for sleep to release holding. You can release it now by simply not maintaining anything. For this moment, there is nothing to keep, nothing to preserve, nothing to monitor. Experience is free to soften completely. When holding ends, there is no collapse, there is relief. The Buddha did not teach people to let go of life. He taught them to let go of holding life. When holding stops, rest deepens beyond anything effort could create. Not because you did something, but because you finally stopped gripping what was never meant to be held. At this point, there is nothing left to understand, nothing left to remember, nothing left to apply. If the mind is still listening, it can rest from listening. If it is drifting, it can drift without correction. No part of this needs to be carried forward. Everything that had to loosen has already begun loosening, not because you made it happen, but because you stopped interfering long enough for it to occur on its own. The body knows what to do when it is no longer supervised. Awareness knows how to fade when it is no longer held in place. You do not need to keep anything from this. Insight does not need to be stored. Silence does not need to be preserved. Rest does not need to be protected. All of that belongs to effort, and effort has already served its purpose. Nothing more is required of you now. Not attention, not understanding, not intention. Life continues without your management. Breath continues. The heart continues. The body restores itself without asking permission. The mind can finally stop explaining itself to itself. Let thoughts come if they come. Let them go if they go. There is no need to follow either movement. The present moment does not need commentary. It does not need improvement. It does not need confirmation. You are allowed to disappear into rest without announcing it. Silence is not something you enter at the end. It is what remains when there is no longer a reason to move away from what is already here. And when movement ends, even gently, sleep arrives without effort. There is nothing you need to do next. Let the mind fade. Let the body sink. Let awareness soften and dissolve on its own. This is not an ending. It is a stopping. And in that stopping, rest takes over completely.